Welcome to Electronic Music Survey. This time we're going to be looking at the move from synthesizers from the purely academic into mainstream usage. One of the things that really prompted that transition was the desire to use the Moog synthesizers as a live performance instrument. So we'll start by analysing this transition by following the story of the Moog synthesizer at this time. So it was 1969, and just under a year since Switched On Bach was released to critical acclaim, that Robert Moog was invited to put on a performance at the Museum for Modern Art in New York as part of their popular Jazz in the Garden concert series. Up until this point, Moog synthesizers had been designed as studio tools to effectively replace the cobbled together devices that were found in the, at that point, contemporary electronic music studio. So instead of sourcing individual oscillators, amplifiers and filters and then putting them together yourselves, the Moog synthesizer delivered like an all-in-one system that contained all those different components. The thing is, the way that it was used by composers and musicians at that point was essentially to be multi-tracked in a studio, so patching in one sound, performing that, and then changing the patch again to then record a second part and overlaying them, and so on and so forth. So for this concert, Moog realized that they needed to come up with a system that would allow the performers to change these patches during the concert, because they didn't want to use the same patch the whole time, but without having to stop the performance and ask the audience to wait for, 2, 3, 5 minutes whilst they got the next patch ready. So to facilitate this, Bob got to work and designed some new modules that allowed the synthesizer to essentially have around 6 different preset patches that could be switched between at the touch of a button by the performer. So the concert went ahead on August 28th in 1969, and it was a real success, even though at one point an audience member stepped on like the main power cable that managed to disconnect all the power from all the synthesizers and sound essentially just stopped. The concert still received rave reviews from the press and impressed and inspired many of the almost 4,000 people that attended the concert. One thing it definitely did do was highlight the need to think about the synthesizer's design in the context of live performance. Not only what the performer needs from the synthesizer in that context, but also ultimately what type of music Moog imagined should be played on his synthesizers. One of the first ever live synthesizer groups was Mother Mallard's Portable Masterpiece Company, or Mother Mallard for short, and it was formed by David Borden in 1968. He was a dance composer and became convinced of the idea that electronic music was meant to be performed live. The thing that they're interesting about them is they talk about preparing for a performance in a way that's similar to an army drill, in that they'd have hours of rehearsals that no music would be played, but they'd simply practice the patch changes required to move from one song to another in a set with military precision. So that's the type of thing that these performers were up against in this late 60s period. One of the other main challenges that performers faced when using these Moog synthesizers live was that the oscillators were very susceptible to temperature, or the ambient temperature, and that would affect the tuning of the oscillators. So sometimes the performers would just have to keep one hand on the tuning knob and another hand on the keyboard the whole time just to keep the thing in tune. And it's things like this that led to kind of deeper questions for Moog about, again, the type of music that he saw these synthesizers being designed to play. And it's on that point that it's interesting to note that around the time of all these developments with the Moog synthesizer, there's another synthesizer inventor and developer called Don Buchler, who's working on the other side of the country in San Francisco, developing synthesizers for a group of people that were not interested in making or recreating any form of traditional Western music at all. They weren't interested in the tempered chromatic scale. They weren't interested in playing any form of traditional harmony, major and minor chords, etc. They were purely interested in exploring and developing new methods for composing with sound. So whereas the Moog synthesizers had always come with a keyboard as part of the assembly or part of the design, the Buchler synthesizers, on the other hand, generally didn't have anything that represented a standard piano keyboard. So it's not surprising that after the success of Switched on Bach, there was a whole swath of people interested in the Moog synthesizer, not so much as a vehicle to explore new compositional methods through the exploration of sound, but rather as a way to explore these new sounds and timbres, but in the context of traditional Western music, stuff that already existed, like Bach and other contemporary and classical compositions. And this was, of course, aided by the inclusion of the standard piano-style keyboard, unlike the Buchler. Another noteworthy example of early live performance using Moog synthesizers is Gershon and Kingsley. Kingsley, along with Jean-Jacques Perrey, created the album The In Sound from Way Out in 1966, which was a combination of synthesizers like the Ondeline and other poppy percussive kind of parts that was a real hit. And together they would have been responsible for some of the earliest Moog recordings pre-Switched on Bach. After attending the MOMA concert, Kingsley decided that he wanted to try his hand at putting on his own synthesizer concert, and through his connections managed to hook up a gig at Carnegie Hall in New York in January of 1970. The only problem was, even though he had a date booked, he didn't have any music, didn't have any synthesizers, and he didn't have anyone to play them. But after making a deal with a record company to give them exclusive rights to the recording of the performance, he managed to get an advance he needed to buy the synths, and then went to the local universities and colleges and auditioned over 150 different people to play these synths in his ensemble. Once he picked them, he not only had to organize the music for them to play, but he also had to teach them how to use the synthesizers. Even so, Kingsley managed to put on the concert at Carnegie Hall, but it didn't receive very good reviews from the press, saying that it was a bit kitschy and a poor emulations of the sounds and the styles and genres they were trying to recreate. One lasting legacy that did come from that ensemble, though, was the tune Popcorn, which Kingsley claims to have composed based on an old Jewish folk tune. One of the original members of Kingsley's ensemble went on to record a version of Popcorn that became an international hit and one of the most recognizable Moog tracks of all time. One of the most recognizable names associated with playing a Moog synthesizer is Keith Emerson. Born in 1944, Keith Emerson grew up in the UK and learned piano as a child. And as a young adult was an accomplished and versatile musician playing in pubs and clubs. Early in his career, Emerson was a member of a band called The Nice, who had some success with a rendition of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3. And it was up until this point that Emerson had focused his efforts on being a predominantly organ performer, performing on a Hammond organ, and experimenting with weird and wacky ways to get untraditional and jarring and exciting sounds out of the Hammond organ by doing things like opening it up on stage and tapping on the valves and reverb springs and stuff like that. And as the story goes, one day he walked into a record store and he heard Switched On Bach playing in the record store and said to the store owner, "What on earth is that? What's making that sound? How can I get my hands on it?" Once he identified it as a Moog synthesizer, initially his manager for the NICE tried to contact Moog in America and convince them to send them a synthesizer for free as a promotional tool to help them spread the Moog synthesizer over in the UK. But Moog declined, saying that would be unfair to other bands like the Beatles and the Stones, who had already purchased their synthesizers, so they couldn't really give them out for free. But Emerson managed to track down a Moog synthesizer in the UK and have it available to him at a live performance at a concert, at which he played the theme from Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, which had recently been released. After a while, Emerson grew weary of playing with the NICE and decided to form a new band with members of other bands at that time. One of them was the bass player from King Crimson, and another was a drummer, and they formed the band Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Emerson, who had since purchased a Moog synthesizer, happened to receive one of the modified ones that was used at the Museum of Modern Art concert that included the preset modules that Moog had specifically made for that concert. So even though the engineers at Moog had included some diagrams of basic patches to use with the synthesizer, you can imagine it'd be a very daunting task to try and put one of these together and make them work for the first time if you've never done it before. So Mike Vickers, a member of the Manfred Mann band and the person who originally lent his Moog to Emerson that first time round, took the synth, put it together, created those first 6 patches and saved them using the preset modules. And these essentially became the first 6 sounds that the sound of Emerson, Lake and Palmer was based off. But to get back to that key difference between the Moog synthesizers and other competitors or alternatives like bookless synthesizers, the inclusion of a piano-style keyboard meant that the first thing that a piano player or keyboardist would do when they approach the synthesizer is go to play a chord. And in the case of the Moog Modular and other synthesizers of the time, like the Arp Odyssey and even the Mini Moog, they were monophonic and could only play one note at a time. So this was like a key difference between what the performer or the keyboard performer expected to be able to do and what the synthesizers could actually deliver. So throughout the 70s, you see synthesizer companies designing and developing synths with polyphonic capabilities, eventually culminating around the late 70s and early 80s with synthesizers like the Sequential Circuits Prophet 5, Jupiters, the Roland Jupiter 4, 6 and 8, and synthesizers like the Yamaha CS70 and 80. The sheer scale of the task, though, to produce these synthesizers that had real, true polyphonic capabilities meant that there was a lot of research and development required to create these synths in a way that was somewhat affordable, even though they were still pretty expensive for the time. Though ultimately a lot of this work would come up short with the release of the Yamaha DX7 in 1983. It was a digital synthesizer that boasted 16-note polyphony. something that the majority of other synth designs hadn't even come close to. This meant that the keyboard player could hold down the sustain pedal on a DX7 and not really notice much difference in terms of polyphony between the DX7 and another keyboard like a Rhodes or a Whirly. So by the mid-80s, polyphonic digital synthesizers were the norm, and the analog synthesizers that were being manufactured often had around 6 voices of polyphony. So that meant that for a lot of keyboard players at that time, their role reverted back to what had traditionally been as more of an accompaniment instrument that can lay down chords and pads and other things like that to fill out an arrangement, rather than being a monophonic solo or bass type instrument. Though it's interesting to note that the role of like the lead guitarist or the soloist in the band is what drew crowds to Keith Emerson's use of the Moog synthesizer. And the very first example of that on record is the song Lucky Man by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. In the outro to this song, Emerson improvised a solo in one take that he has since, been interviewed and said he's not totally proud of, but it does represent a turning point in which the keyboard player went from being someone at the back of the stage to someone like Jimi Hendrix or a saxophone player who's at the front of the stage and is at the center of everyone's attention. And as I said in the beginning, this story of Keith Emerson and his rise to fame as a Moog rock star is just one of the many ways that synthesizers began to transform their image from almost scientific equipment to something that was part of the everyday musical culture. That's it for Electronic Music Survey. See you next time.